Chapter 4. After his failure to persuade Makalay he was a hero, Yankuba fell into double trouble. Makalay began to avoid him as though he had the "don't touch me" disease. If, by coincidence, they met and he tried to speak to her, she grunted a monosyllabic reply. He was tormented and had to force himself to eat, but he could not sleep. He became as restless as a bull chased by a tsetse fly. He wrote her letters, and she tore them up in his face without reading them. He wrote more letters. She destroyed them, eyes and nostrils dilating with fury. Yankuba tore out pages to write more pleas until his notebook became empty. Then he wrote her his last letter. He didn't see her tear it to pieces, but she didn't reply or talk to him either. "What's the matter with you?" Dura asked one day, as he met Yankuba in the yard, sighing and moaning with a face that looked stupid with grief. "You are not yourself these days. Is it Makalay?" "I'm all right, father." "You are not. I've been watching you these past days. And even though you didn't tell me about your shameless behavior, I heard of it. You are now the #1 topic of conversation around the bonfires at night." Dura spat. "Deceiving a woman to make her think you are brave. What happened to your manhood? I am ashamed to call you my son." "Please, father," Yankuba raised a hand, averting his face. "Things are bad enough as they are." "Because of your big talk," Dura retorted, starting into the house in a huff. He stopped abruptly at the doorway as though he had forgotten something and glanced back at Yankuba. "I hope you now realize that, even though you stand on your book wisdom as if on top of a coconut tree, your mother and I can see farther than you." He gave him a penetrating look. "And since you have spoiled everything between you and Makalay, your mother and I think it is high time you started thinking about Fatmata, the daughter of Mama Balo. At least you cannot say this time we have selected a woman you do not know." He spat again and stamped into the house. With slumped shoulders, drooping face, and a bucket in one hand, Yankuba headed for the well across the yard to draw up water for a bath. Before he could reach the well, Pose stepped out into the yard from among the bushes. She carried on her head a basket full of potato leaves and other cooking ingredients. "Oh, Yankuba," she said, hurrying to her doorless kitchen and putting the basket down on the floor. "Could you go into the forest and bring me some wood to cook the evening meal?" Not hearing a reply, she came out of the kitchen and squinted at her son, as Yankuba put down his bucket and started back to the house for the axe to cut the sticks. "Did you hear me?" she asked. "Of course I know you are tired and all that, but dash, I heard you," Yankuba cried out, stepping into the house for the axe. Posea's mouth snapped shut. She stared at the slumped figure of her son and her heart went out to him. She knew he was reaping the sad consequences of his foolhardiness, but as the old proverb says, there's no bad bush to throw away a bad child. "Can I say something before you go to the woods?" she said, going towards him. Yankuba shrugged and waited for her to have her say. "I know things are not going well between you and Makalay," she said. "I cannot entirely blame you, for you are a grown man. But your father and I are worried about you. We'd love to see you happily married and fathering children." The same old song all over again. "I know," Pose said patiently. "But Makalay is not in it this time. She's not worthy of you." Yankuba winced. Pose untied and retied the lapel cloth around her generous waist. She was treading dangerous ground, and so must proceed tactfully and adapt to the circumstances like a chameleon. "You see, I'm your father and I don't want you to feel pressure to marry Makalay. She has turned out to be a disappointment." "But I love her, mother," Yankuba cried out. "I love her so much. It is this love thing that you read in your books that is holding you captive to Makalay. In fact, your father and I are of the strong opinion that you must stop thinking about Makalay since she doesn't care about you." Yankuba glared at her. She shrank back. "What are you saying?" he asked. "What have you and father cooked up for me this time?" Pose laid a hand on his arm. "Yankuba, don't say another word." She nodded toward the forest. "Go bring me some wood. And while you are at it, just try to forget Makalay and then think slowly about Fatmata, Mama Balo's daughter. Such a charming, caring girl. She'll soon come out as an initiate of the Bondo Society. And you think that qualifies her to be my wife? Yankuba's face twitched with anger. Did I say I am in love with her? Don't get angry with me. Pose gently pushed him toward the forest. Go cut down the wood. You don't have to make an immediate decision about Fatmota. Don't rush it. She shook her head with a look of tenderness. Yankuba stormed away into the woods, axe in hand, trembling with rage. He veered off the path, shoving and kicking low branches and bushes out of his way, until he found himself in a part of the forest he had never seen before. He started swinging the sharp axe against the trees and branches. His thoughts were not on the wood he was supposed to cut, nor on Fatmota, the fresh choice of his parents. His mind was a whirlpool of painful thoughts about Makalay, and each swing of the axe was like letting off steam, exorcising the fury within him, filling the tormenting void Makalay had carved in his heart with ferocious action. The axe swung continuously, forcefully, biting deep and cutting down branches with a resounding crash, shaving the bark of the trees. Soon his sweat became big drops, soaking his body, his shirt and stinging his eyes. He continued smashing down branches and foliage. Then he began to roar. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you, he howled, laying waste more trees. Suddenly some powerful force tore the axe from him. He whirled round to see two men standing at a safe distance from him, Sina of the myopic, shifty eyes, and his priestly brother with the flat eyes like a lizard. Sina was dressed in an old, faded shirt with a pair of trousers folded up to his calves. The priest was costumed in a fear-inspiring sleeveless ronco lined with cowries that were held in place by a thick fold of red thread. Around his neck hung a necklace made from the canines of a cat and the skeletal remains of some unknown little creature. In his hand he brandished the tail of a bull that had been dipped for days in some stinking lasmomi liquid to give it spiritual powers. The stench from it was suffocating. What bothers worried thy mind? Asked the priest in his official jargon, designed to impress and inspire obedience. Thou hast committed a crime of despicable proportions. Yankuba, still breathing heavily and sweating, glowered at the two brothers. Who are you? He is the priest, replied Sina with a haughty look, the one you taunted when you first arrived. So, you better watch your words and don't act clever with him. Why? He can read your thoughts. He is so powerful. Yankuba continued to glare and growl. Thou hast not answered my question. The priest shook the tail in his hand. Dost thou think thou art beyond my powers? Dost thou not know I represented the gods? Give me back my axe. Yankuba took a menacing step forward. The priest stepped back quickly behind his brother who held Yankuba's axe in his hand. We'll give thy axe to thy father, said the priest, flat eyes peering boldly over Sina's shoulders. Behold thy crime. With a sweep of his hand, he indicated the fallen branches and foliage around. Thou hast presumptuously destroyed sacred bush. Knowest thou the penalty for all this? A male sheep and 2 hens. Give me back my axe. You are arrogant, Sina snarled. Your cocky attitude is responsible for your failure to win the heart of a woman. Yankuba began to vibrate, but Sina took no note. He lowered his head and squinted at Yankuba. What a woman you turned out to be. You and your big mouth. Yankuba jumped at them. They were so startled that the axe fell from Sina's grip. The priest tripped on his own heels as he turned to flee. Yankuba went berserk, hurling stones at them like hailstones. The priest took to his heels, knees knocking audibly against each other, while Sina scrambled away, like a giant spider, because of his bowlegs. They did not stop running until they reached Dura's house, where they gasped at the terrible, devilish thing Yankuba had done to them. Seeing that Dura was shaken by the news, Sina immediately informed him about the fine of a sheep and 2 hens imposed on Yankuba. Back at the forest, Yankuba walked around in an exhausted daze, then slumped down at the foot of a tree. Visions of Makalay tormented his mind and waves of depression crowded in on him. Under the weight of this despair, he bowed his head into his hands and wept like a woman. His hunched body shook with each racking sob that squeezed out from the core of his broken heart. For a long time, he sat like that, head bowed on hands laid on top of drawn-up knees. When the tears stopped flowing, his heart felt lighter, as though he had wept Makalay out of it. His eyes were heavy with sleep. When his father, face crinkled with worry, came and shook his shoulder, Yankuba realized he had actually fallen asleep naturally. He was surprised to discover that he was no longer worried about Makalay. Makalay went to bed feeling a bit depressed. She had been feeling that way for quite some time without knowing why. She was turning over to sleep when the truth hit her like a clap of thunder. She sat up suddenly. It was true. She was no longer having to avoid Yankuba because Yankuba was actively snubbing her. He had stopped making any attempts to either corner her in the staff room, or bump into her at a doorway, or walk on the other side of the road pretending not to see her. He had even stopped writing her letters. In a strange way, she missed these things that had made her feel important in his eyes. Now she felt like a nobody, a nonentity without his admiring glances. Why, though, did she feel depressed about it since she wasn't in love with him? She had to admit to herself that she missed him. Perhaps I overreacted, she convinced herself after much thought, recalling with a pang of distress how Yankuba's face had shrunk when she had screamed, "I hate you." She shouldn't have said that, never mind what had happened. Well, true, I'm not in love with him, she reasoned with herself, although I'm really fond of him. But in love with him. She giggled with girlish delight, although she didn't know why she found the situation funny. Okay, I admit I miss him like the cool shade of a tree that has been cut down. He'll never be dashingly handsome, but he's fun to be with, he's straightforward, has a quick brain that can twist my words upside down. And I love dash. She caught her breath while her hand flew to her mouth to stop the flow of words. What am I saying? She giggled again. I am not in love with him, or am I? Then his words on the veranda, his arrogant cocksure words, came flooding back to her. Stop it, she had snapped at him. I am not in love with you. You are, he had replied, relaxing back with that confident smile she now missed so much, but you haven't realized it yet. If you marry me, I have the babies. Makalay burst into helpless laughter. Her hand flew back to her mouth as she stared round-eyed at the door. Her uncle, the headmaster, was beyond the door in the living room, reading. She didn't want him to come peering round her door with an inquisitive, worried frown. He didn't. Then with a cry of surprise she remembered Yankuba's last letter of appeal to her. She had not torn it apart piece by piece as she had its predecessors. Quickly, she flung the sheet away from her, swung her feet down, hurried to her handbag on the study table, opened it, rummaged around the bric-a-brac in it, and with a sigh of relief fished out the letter. She felt a rapturous sensation wash through her. She sat at the edge of the chair, turned up the wick of the oil lamp and carefully unfolded the letter with the dizzy expectation of confessions of undying love that would make Romeo and Juliet envious. Instead, a stuttered cry of disappointment escaped her lips as she read. Dear Miss Hard to Get. For most of us crushes are as common as colds, but we soon get over them. I was desperately in love with you, or so I thought. But you took pleasure in frustrating me. Nothing I did pleased you. Like a tally clerk, you kept account of my mistakes in order to fling them back in my face when the mood was on you. I believe the fault was mine. I misled myself, reading romantic interest into your dubious, innocent words and actions. When I decided to take an objective look at you, I discovered enough evidence to prove that cultivating romantic interest for you is very unhealthy for me. Thanks for the experience. Yankuba. She read the letter over and over until her eyes misted with unshed tears. There were none of his usual compliments that made her feel warm, cozy, and wanted. With a feeling of abandonment, she put her elbow on the table, cupped her chin in the hollow of her palm and stared vacantly into space, trying to recapture a lost sense of romance. After a long moment she drew in her breath, dried her eyes with the back of her hand, and took the letter to her uncle in the living room. At the sound of the door opening, the headmaster, seeing the sadness of Makalay's face, closed the book he was reading and uncrossed his legs. His thick eyebrows arched, but he didn't say anything. He waited. Uncle, Makalay stopped by his side. Can you spare me 5 minutes? Why not? The headmaster gave her a wide smile and pointed to the chair close to him. Please sit down and tell me how I could be of help. Makalay sat down, bowed her head, groaned, sighed, gathered herself and lifted her big eyes to her uncle. It's Yankuba. She began with unusual nervousness. He was in love with me, and he wrote me this letter. She thrust the letter at the headmaster. How could he write me such a letter? How could he? The headmaster read the letter with a deep frown. As he carefully folded it and handed it back to her, he suppressed an amused smile from growing wider on his large face. With an intense look of sympathy and a twitch of his fat mustache, he asked Makalay, "Are you in love with him?" "Yes." "No." She fluttered. We were just friends, ordinary friends." "Can a boy and a girl remain ordinary friends if they keep seeing each other exclusively?" asked the headmaster. "You and Yankuba have been seeing each other exclusively. It is only natural then for one or both of you to develop romantic interest in the other." "But suppose it is one-sided?" Makalay argued. "For example, he is in love with me at a time when I only want a platonic relationship. With a member of the opposite sex you keep seeing on a regular basis, and exclusively at that." The headmaster chuckled. "If I didn't know your age, I'd say you talk like a teenager who's still in the first bloom of youth and struggling with strange feelings." He paused, seeing the pain look in her face. "Anyway, my dear daughter, you are not leveling with me. That doesn't matter much. But you must be honest with yourself. Because one of the greatest crimes you can commit is to keep lying to yourself until you believe the lie is true." "What do you mean?" "Well," the headmaster crossed his legs again and relaxed back in his chair. "For example, you say you only wanted a platonic relationship with a man you kept meeting regularly until it was too late. He fell for you, then subsequently wrote this letter informing you in clear terms that he was no longer romantically interested in you. Why does the letter bother you if you are not in love with him?" Makalay bit her lip and gazed at her feet. In a low voice she asked, "Suppose, for the sake of argument, suppose I am in love with him, how do I get him back in view of his letter?" The headmaster tugged at his unfortunate mustache to hide the grin on his face. "Well, for the sake of argument, let us imagine that you are taking a horse to water. How can you make the horse drink voluntarily?" Makalay frowned at her hands, at the ceiling, at the floor and confessed that she didn't know how she could do that. "It's a simple secret," the headmaster said. "First thing to do is, make the horse thirsty, then it will drink without force. The same thing applies in your case. Make Yankuba thirsty for your companionship and he'll come to you voluntarily." When Makalay finally returned to her bed in her room, she kept thinking of different ways to make Yankuba thirsty, but each way looked so unsatisfactory that she became depressed and tossed and turned sleeplessly until the early hours of the morning. And still she hadn't been inspired by any method of getting Yankuba to run back to her.